So my question is about inflation. How is it possible for the major central banks of this world to almost quadruple the money supply without any real effect on inflation?
The legal status of the outright monetary transactions is being discussed at the moment. So I was interested in what do you think will be the consequences of the decision?
Can you explain why the European Commission is accusing Germany of exporting too much standards? So if you say they're basically harmful, the 0% GDP deficit, do you think in the long term it will be amended, or will they remain like that?
And I don't get why it is bad for a country to have a consistent positive trade balance when you're not in a common currency.
Well, this is quite simple in the sense that a lot of people are hoarding money, as it's called. So to hoard money, what does that mean? It means that traditionally, let's take Milton Friedman. That's the easiest way to tell it, if you don't mind. Yeah? Milton Friedman, we all know who Milton Friedman is, yeah? The great Milton Friedman. And he had this helicopter. And this helicopter is flying over the country and distributing money. We call this helicopter money. Yeah? And people get money. And what do they do with the money? They buy goods. And what happens? There are no more goods, so prices go up. Very simple. Yeah? If you spread out twice as much as money, prices double. That's basically your question. Yeah? So if this helicopter flying over the country, throwing out money, people get the money, go to the shops, buy goods, and prices double. So why doesn't that happen? Because people don't go to the shops. Because people keep the money in their pockets. That's the problem. That's what we call hoarding. In Dutch, oppotten. So we keep the money basically inactive in a way. And the reason why we're keeping it inactive is because people is a complicated concept. We talk about agents, economic agents, that sounds much more nicer, doesn't it? And these are banks, for instance. And if banks keep the money in their vaults because they are afraid of lending it to other banks, because the other bank might go broke, then all of a sudden the money is hoarded in the system. And this is happening on an enormous scale, basically. And if the central bank would not provide the money, then the banks would not be able to do anything, and the whole system would break down, essentially. So in order to keep the system going, the central bank started to inject money in an enormous way. But the central banks are very alert, of course, and this is what you see in the, I keep these sheets on for that reason also. Well, this is what you saw, oh, this is too fast. This is what you saw. Central banks are very alert that they are able to reduce it if necessary. And as I said, the discussion is now whether the ECB is not reducing it too fast. Because what you see now, all of a sudden, is prices are going down again. So you see that the prices, to a certain extent, breathe with the money stock, as you're saying, but not one-to-one. So the Friedman story doesn't hold because of the hoarding problem. And the hoarding is not only simple consumers, but in particular also banks and firms, etc. Yeah, is that?
I think I can ask one follow-up question.
Yeah, if.
So my follow-up question would be, suppose for some magical reason we manage to get out of this crisis, and we see regular growth rates reappearing. Is there a chance that we will at one point run into very high inflation with this massively increased money supply once we're out of the trouble, so to speak?
Well, implicitly you are assuming that the central banks are either not able or not willing to reduce money supply. If you say this, well, what I did show you is even when we are not having this miracle, they are reducing it already enormously. But look what happened, what the ECB did. From 3,200 to 2,200 in almost a year.
What about the US?
Well, that's the difference. I love the US, I mean, they are really, but they are tapering now, But there's a big difference between the US and Europe, of course. What's the big difference? No, yeah, but what's the big difference in a global scale between the US and Europe?
The central bank is not independent.
Oh yes,
They can
it is.
actually quantitative easing.
No, that's not true.
No.
All these banks are pretty independent. Well, pretty independent, but they are forced by the governments to do this, not by law, but because the governments are inactive. But that's also happening in the ECB, the way the ECB did. So. No, that's not the difference. What's the difference between the US, not the Fed, but the US and Europe? Everybody wants to have dollars, not everybody wants to have euros. That's the big difference. So the US dollars are spread all over the world, much more than the euro is. So that's much more complicated. And what you saw is that when this tapering started, all of a sudden in Latin America and India, etc., a lot of problems arose. Whereas when the ECB is doing this, nobody blinks an eye. That's the difference. So the US dollar is a world currency essentially.
Thank you. Would you classify France as a southern or a northern country?
The funny thing is that in the usual distinctions, it's neither. So it's in a way asexual, if you may call it that way. So it's always somehow in between. Funny enough, but that's the case. And it's a strange country because it's nationalizing all these things. It does a lot of things which are not really fashionable in Europe, but it's still doing not that bad either. So it's a strange country in that respect. It's neutral between north and south in a way. It's definitely not north, but it's also not south.
On slide number 33, I think you showed that the Netherlands' growth rate since 1980, or the increase in productivity was the highest.
Yeah.
But can you explain then why prices increase in the Netherlands higher than the EU average, which is on the next slide, I think, on slide
easy.
34. Yeah.
You can answer it yourself, I think. If wages increase faster than productivity, prices increase. But the wages didn't increase that fast. I'm not sure. This is not that high, actually, 37, compared to what the serious country did. So, but there has been more wage increase in the Netherlands. I mean, what you should realize is, this is 95 till 2008, yeah? The Netherlands had its big reforms in the 80s, with the Wassenaar Agreement, etc., which was in 83. And so we had our big reforms then, and then we started to grow moderately. Germany started to have 4 reforms much later, under Schröder. So the German reforms are fully reflected here, and the Dutch reforms have already been there, and they're not. So that's what part of the difference. Yeah.
Can you explain why the European Commission is accusing Germany of exporting too much? That's like a recent argument by the European Commission. I think you started on explaining that already.
Yeah, well, it's not only the Commission is late in accusing Germany from that. I mean, the OECD has been doing that for ages, the IMF has been doing that for ages, I have been doing that. No, but anyhow, I mean, the point is, the Netherlands also, by the way, but the Netherlands is too small, so we are doing it hidden in a way. But we even have a larger trade surplus than Germany has, consistently. So when a country is exporting 10% more of its GDP, like the Netherlands is, think for 1 minute what that means. Every year, we earn 10% more than we spend to the other country. So we accumulate foreign assets, in a way, for 10%. This is not exactly true, by the way, because we're bad investors, but that's a different story. So we invest our money badly, and we lose on that, thank the Lord, so it's not 10%, but still it's quite a surplus, because between the current account surplus and the trade balance surplus, these are footnotes. But anyhow, if you are exporting systematically more than you're importing, somebody else has to import systematically more than it exports. And that's strange, basically. So you could, why would we accuse a country of importing more than it exports and applaud a country who's exporting more than it imports? That's basically implicit in this discussion, you see. And what is normal in economic discussions, but I think Bart Verspaag will talk, I predict that he will talk about it next week, otherwise you ask him about it. You have the catching up argument. So poor countries, they have to industrialize, so they are importing normally more than they export, and this is called catching up. And this could hold for Portugal, Greece, and Spain, etc., because they want to catch up, and then they import more than they export. But then they converge somehow to the rich countries, to the exporting countries, and in the end, everything becomes more normalized. You see, so that's a transitionary process. And in that situation, it's natural. But consistently exporting more than you're importing is accumulating consistently more money from the others than you are doing, having your, and that's really, well, creating tensions, as I showed you already. So that's underlying the discussion. And then people start to wonder what the hell is going on. And this was a big debate, for instance, between China and the US. And China was accused to keep the yen too low, for instance, the yuan too low, which they did, by the way, in order to be able to export more, etc. But the US was greedily importing more. So these imbalances cannot persist. This is my point. They can be temporary, but they should not persist. And in Germany and the Netherlands, they persist. And that's creating tensions, as I showed you.
Do you foresee a future where the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency?
Wow. Let me put it this way. I would not be surprised, like at some time the Roman Empire disappeared, yeah? And at some time the UK was not dominating the world. In that sense, I would not be surprised if at some times the US will not dominate the world. But then you are thinking of a much larger scale, I think, than you are asking us implicitly. I don't foresee in the coming decades that the US will be not a reserve currency. But China is gaining its importance. It's now already the second economy in the world. It has passed Japan, big hooray, hoorays, etc. So, yeah.
Thank you. Some were advocating for the Greece to exit the Eurozone.
Yeah. So
I wonder what's your point of view on that?
Oh, I have a very clear view on that. I have two views on that. Sorry, there are two aspects of my view. One is a more technical aspect, and one is more political aspect. The technical aspect is very simple, and you can tell it in one sentence. You cannot unscramble a scrambled egg. It's very hard the complications are so incredibly enormous that it's very costly. So the costs can hardly ever exceed the benefits. Can hardly ever motivate the benefit. But the political argument is much more important, because if Greek falls, who's next? Because then the financial markets smell all of a sudden that they can start to speculate and they will go for the next one. This is one of the reasons, I guess, why the European political leaders in the end did not want to have Greek falling. Because they realized that if Greece would fall, the next would be Cyprus or Portugal or whatever, and it would go on and on and on. So that's one element. That's a very simple political element. But the underlying element is that why should you not allow these countries to fall if they are bad anyhow, bad apples in the basket or something like that? And this is the notion: why is there European Union? And if you think of European Union only as an economic project, then let me take one step back. In the 80s, in the late 80s, there was an enormous discussion about the introduction of the euro. And the Americans were very active in that discussion, which is not surprising because they have experience with one currency. And there is a lot of literature about one currency. This is, and some of you have heard about the optimal currency area, Mandela, etc., and countries have to satisfy certain criteria, etc. It was obvious that Europe did not satisfy these criteria. So it was obvious for economists that Europe did not have the criteria to make a successful European currency union. And time has proven it. So why did they pursue it then? Well, what you should realize, Luc Soete and Clemens Kool and I wrote a pamphlet against the introduction of the euro. We were against it. Not for ideological reasons, but because there was a huge discussion going on between the EMU and the EPU. The EMU was the European Monetary Union, and the EPU was the European Political Union. And it was a kind of a chicken-egg discussion, which should be first. Could you have a monetary union without a political union? Yes or no? Well, Luc Soete, Clemens Kool and I argued no. You should have first a democratic framework in which you can fit in the whole European structure, and then you can start to think about introducing a currency. More pragmatic politicians, well, Luc is actually quite pragmatic, but anyhow, more pragmatic politicians said, well, time will come. Let's introduce this euro, and you will see that Europe will be forced to accept a political union. And lo and behold, even Merkel is nowadays advocating essentially a political union. So, what I want to say, and this is an indirect answer to the Greek story, it's far bigger than this monetary story, and it's far bigger than this economic story. It's about having Europe as a concept which has a tradition and which has to be integrated and to contain. Germany has to be contained, France has to be contained, UK has to be contained. So we all have to live together. And this requires that we have a union which fits in. And the introduction of the euro was part of that process. And giving up the euro for many people would also mean giving up these ambitions. And that's far much more than economic reasoning. So that's my second answer.
Yes, thank you. You were, I think, advocating that having a consistent positive trade balance for over 50 years in the case of Holland and Germany is in the end also something bad in a sense for the country. And I understand that when you are in a common currency, in a currency union, but 50 years ago, 40 years ago, we were not in a currency union yet.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't get why it is bad for a country to have a consistent positive trade balance when you're not in a common currency.
Well, because then your currencies will align occasionally, which they did all the time. The German, the Deutsche Mark and the Dutch Gulden were appreciating all the time. So we were becoming more and more expensive all the time, basically. So there's a movement between the currencies to correct for the trade imbalances, basically. If I import from Spain, I would pay in pesetas, and Spain would pay in guilders. So the peseta-guilder ratio was changing all the time, if you look in the history.
But we would become more expensive then, in a way, as you are saying.
Yes, you're right.
This would mean that in the end we would have more difficulties with.
Yes, and then again we started to grow out of that, and again we had the depreciation. We had an appreciation. Yeah.
But if I get it right, as long as you are able to then export still more as you are importing, then why does this matter so much?
First of all, the excess. We never did 10% in those days. This was only a modest trade balance difference, about 4 or 5%. No, even less, I guess. So these were more modest excess exports, current account surpluses. That's one element, and the other element is that, as I said already, because if you depreciate, also the foreign debt will change, because that's one of the problems of China has with the US, for instance. Because if the US is paying China in dollars, and the dollar will inflate away, then the US debt will go down again. And this happened also with the Spanish, if I take Spain as an example, with the Spanish Dutch things, etc. So these realignments also meant that the debts changed. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you.
Could you speak towards the austerity measures taken up by the Southern European countries, and if they're ever a viable solution during large global recessions?
I think that austerity measures per se are not the right answer. That's obvious from the way I talk about them. In the sense that cutting expenditures as a macroeconomic measure in a downward cyclical situation is a very stupid thing to do in a way, from a macroeconomic point of view. So in that sense, only cutting the budgets or raising taxes when you are already in a downward cycle, which is typically pro-cyclical, but then in the downward sense, is stupid from a macroeconomic point of view. That's one answer to your question, I think. The other, but that does not imply that the only thing the government should do is spend more. I mean, there are a lot of problems, as I tried to make clear, which are there. And one of the big problems is the low productivity of the South compared to the North. And I'm not an expert in that field, but it's not very hard to imagine that that has a lot to do with stupid regulations, for instance. And other problems which can be solved in another way than with austerity measures. So I think that we have to look very carefully and think very carefully how we solve those problems, and that should be the focus, in my perception, of looking at these countries. By the way, I do not want to say that that means that we have to, that I'm advocating a free market system, because it's obvious that I'm not. So I'm not saying we should get rid of regulations, and deregulation is as bad as austerity is if you think about it carefully. Can I elaborate on that for a minute, if you don't mind? Okay. This is just a footnote. Yeah, but free markets is often associated with absence of regulations. Yeah. Well, you should realize that underlying the notion of a free market, there's an incredible amount of regulations, textbooks, and law books, and whatever, all over the place. And we discovered that as economists the very hard way. Do you know when we really discovered that? With the fall of the Iron Curtain. So when all of a sudden, Poland and all the other new member states became new member states, then all of a sudden we discovered that the free market requires a lot of things. And we never thought about it that carefully. Some people did, of course, Hayek did, and some others did, but as economists in general, we never thought that much about what really a free market implies. And we started to realize that a free market implies property rights. You own things. Well, you might think it's normal, but why? And there are a lot of things which are not owned by somebody, and somebody is not responsible for it. So free markets imply a lot of stuff which was taken for granted before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and which we learned the hard way that they should be regulated in a very clear way in order to be functioning. So there's a lot of regulations involved in free markets. That's one element which you should realize. And deregulation is a very stupid notion if you want to advocate free markets. That's one thing. The second thing is that you should be very careful of a race to the bottom in regulations, also in financial sectors, because this is a lot to do with the banking sectors also, of course. If you want to regulate the banks, you should be careful that not all the banks are going to countries which do not regulate things. So there's a lot of it's called regulatory competition. Maybe my friends from finance will talk about it, I'm not sure. So, so you should be careful with regulations. Regulations should make sense. And you should think about why they are there, and they have a purpose, and you should look at the purpose, and you should look at the regulations in relation to the purpose. And there can be a lot of regulations also in the labor market, tenure or minimum wages or whatever, which have a reason. Germany just introduced a minimum wage, which in the Netherlands would unheard of, that you have not a minimum wage. I mean, nobody knew that Germany did not have a minimum wage till all of a sudden they start to discuss it. I mean, so there are a lot of things which we think are normal, and we don't think of that as being deregulation or whatever. A footnote within this footnote. In the Netherlands, they started a discussion about the minimum wage at some stage, because the minimum wage was too high. And then the Ministry of Social Affairs started to look at which firms really pay the minimum wage in their collective agreements. And there was no firm who paid the minimum wage. So the minister said, what the hell are you talking about? So these are simply stupid things in a way. So a lot of, so the point I want to make is, you should look at your regulations. Regulations can hamper economic functioning. And I guess that in the Southern Europe you hear stories which are so strange that they cannot not be true. That there is something to gain there. On the other hand, you should not end up in deregulating everything in a regulatory competition where you have only so-called free market or whatever. Is this answering your question a little bit?
Yes, but so was austerity more of a political move at the time? How did it get passed and with like the northern countries?
Sorry?
How did it get passed with the northern countries? Like, do they have any say in this austerity?
How do you get?
How did I'm assuming at the time, I don't really remember, but did the northern countries have anything to say with the austerity measures being implemented by the southern countries?
Yes, definitely. We so when Draghi said, and he said it, I will do everything to protect your bond, there were small letters. I will everything to protect your bond if. And these ifs are, for instance, if you obey the rules imposed by the Commission, by the European Commission. And so the European Commission now has the power to, if countries want to apply for help at the European Union, which they can do nowadays, even the president of our central bank proposed Eurobonds, by the way. If a country wants to get help from the European Union, they can apply for it, but then they have to obey certain rules. And in order to obey these rules, and they can only get help if they obey these rules. So this is one of the ways that we do it. And this can be these austerity measures. And this is also has been imposed a lot by the IMF and by the World Bank in the Washington Consensus in developing countries and in Asia, etc. So there has been a lot of discussion about the experience in those countries and the devastating results of that. And we learned a lot from that. And the IMF is much more careful now in proposing austerity measures, etc., and looking much more carefully at regulations, etc. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, what can be possibly the role of Eastern Europe on reduction of the fault line between North and South? Also, like, all basically the members of the European Union sign up for the introduction of euro somewhere in the future. I think only Sweden didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be possibly the impact of the enlargement of Eurozone?
Well, first of all, the North-South problem is a Western European problem as I defined it. Yeah? And at this moment, the Eastern European countries are not participants in those discussions. They are entering another discussion, and they are creating another discussion, where we should realize, by the way, that usually the debt situation of the Eastern European countries is much better than the Western European countries. Traditionally, the Eastern European countries have very low sovereign debt, relatively, and compared to Western Europe at least. And the discussion about the Eastern European countries, in particular at this moment Bulgaria and Romania, is about the free movement of labor. And that's a totally different discussion, so I don't want to enter that, but that's the discussion we have with the Eastern European countries. How can they help to solve the North-South problems, if that's your question? Well, they will somehow end up in helping to bail out the South, I guess, as much as they have money to do so, because the South will have to be bailed out, essentially. There will have to be, whatever happens, funds will have to be transferred from the North to the South. And it has to be done in a way that the Germans don't notice it, basically. That's essentially the problem. And how we will do that is still in the discussion.
So an extending question. So do you think that the eastern part would more move toward the northern model, so they're actually going to be beneficial for the Eurozone, and they're not going to implement the same policies as the South did?
I don't want to make, maybe I had some snipes at certain countries, but that's just for fun. I don't want to talk about good guys and bad guys. And I'm not saying that the South is the problem. I don't want to say that. If I created that impression, then I made a mistake. It's just, what I want to emphasize, it's a common problem. And this is also triggering all this question about exporting too much, essentially. So we're all involved in this, and we're all partners in this, and we have been happily been exporting to the South like crazy, yeah, and doing that much more than was essentially reasonable. And so in that sense, we are the bad guys, maybe. I mean, I'm not saying, but I just want to show you that the picture is much more complicated than saying that the South is the problem. There's a serious problem with the South, which is the low productivity, I think. And that has to be solved. And I'm not an expert in that direction, but I think that part of that has to do with the infrastructure and the regulatory infrastructure, as I said already. And I think that we should transfer technologies and help and learn to the South, etc. And definitely not start wage competitions also, which of course that's what we are doing also.
Yes. Well, I also agree with the dangerous effects of austerity measures, but we also already talked about France, and I think that France is the only country to which the Commission granted, that France that it goes beyond the budget deficit of 3%. I think 4% was allowed now, and many argue that this hampers the French willingness to introduce more necessary reforms.
Yeah.
What do you think? Are these necessary reforms? Why?
Okay, that's indeed that's a good question, and that's of course a problem. And this is a more general problem, not only with France, because the Netherlands has also been allowed to. They turned also a blind eye to the Netherlands, etc., etc., etc. There's a huge discussion always, also with stimulating the economy in whatever sense, also with monetary stimulus. If you stimulate the economy, you take away the pressure for austerity measures or for reforms, essentially, because you allow the country to grow and to be more consistent. So does that mean, if you put it that way, I never thought about it that clearly, but if you put it that way, then you suggest that the only way to force reforms are austerity measures. And this is what I meant with my quote about veredelung, basically, yeah? Veredelung in order to get these reforms. Well, I'm not sure that's the most productive and the best way. I mean, why should you not discuss it and try to get it another way and try to explain why it's important to do this and to get social acceptance for all these things? This is basically the way I would look at it. And that's a totally different way, of course, and try to get political agreement that this is necessary. And then we don't need this austerity.
Thank you. You mentioned that some of the policies that have been introduced in recent years by central banks go completely in the opposite direction of what the economic textbooks predict.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any changes in the way academic textbooks are written? How does the academic world deal with this development?
No, that's indeed that's interesting. So when I studied macroeconomics in the 60s, the government could finance its expenditures in 3 ways: taxes, bonds, and printing money. And printing money was one of the normal 3 ways to finance your expenditures. Then I started to teach macroeconomics. And all of a sudden, printing money started to disappear towards footnotes. Taxes and bonds, and oh yes, you could print money. And then it started to appear on the list of thou shalt not. And so if it was mentioned, it was only mentioned as thou shalt not. So you can finance, you can either raise taxes or issue bonds, but you should not print money. And I was teaching this all the time. I mean, I had to teach all these things. And what you will see now, because in academic debate, economists are advocating, as I said already, money creation, and quantitative easing is nothing but printing money in that sense. That people will start to say, well, there are definitely situations in which it's necessary. And that will come back again, I'm quite sure about that. But they will point at the dangers, of course. Because you should realize that when I bought my house, the inflation was 12%. Yeah, so that was one of the reasons after the oil crisis of all this printing money. So printing money also has its dangers. I'm not simply advocating printing money as the solution for any problem. Yeah, but in this specific situation, printing money is definitely warranted.
So when the euro was introduced, why did the European Central Bank set the interest rates so low relative to what they were in the South, for example? You said that they were used to interest rates about 16%,
yeah.
And then suddenly they dropped to 4%. So why didn't they look for a medium that was maybe somewhere between what the northern countries and the southern countries?
I guess you can guess the answer yourself.
Because the decisions were made on I don't know, by northern.
Well, where is the central bank located? Frankfurt. I mean, if you would set the interest rate as first of all, the weights of the economies were totally different. I mean, Germany is a huge economy, and the Netherlands is also a rather big economy. So if you weight the economies, you have already a different story. One. Second, the euro was pretty strong when it was introduced. And it only grew stronger against the dollar. So it didn't need a high interest rate. Yeah? And what would happen for the Netherlands and Germany if you introduce an interest rate of 6% when we are used to an interest rate of 4%? Think of that.
Yeah, but then look at what has happened in the South.
Yeah. Okay, no, I agree with you. So that was a problem, yeah. This was a problem which was not properly foreseen, essentially. I agree with that, but this is only hindsight, yeah.
I think the legal status of the outright monetary transactions is being discussed at the moment. So I was interested, what do you think will be the consequences of the decision?
Well, there is no decision. The decision is to bring it to the Luxembourg court. And if my guess is of the average time the Luxembourg court has to take to deal with this, it's a very elegant decision. Yeah, that's my answer. So it's a very nice way of shelving it, basically. Because when they come to a decision, things have changed again dramatically. A lot of things have happened again, etc. And this is more interesting. It might lead to a debate about the way monetary policy is operated and the position of central banks in general. Because what you should realize, we can bring this up here. You should ask my friends from finance about that. Central banks are independent. Do you realize that it means independent? So under no political process, so under no democratic control. So the organization which basically issues our money is under no democratic control. Is that what we want? Well, so I can imagine. So the point I want to make implicitly is that you are treating very thin ice here. Because as soon as central banks start to do things which are obviously against the public opinion, obviously, then the independence will immediately go out of the window and they will be under control. And the courts will also realize that. So there will be always things going on in such a way that central banks have a careful distance to the public opinion, which is important, but not too far away, because then they will fall through the ice, I guess.
Thank you.
Just one more question concerning the Maastricht goals or the standards. So if you say they're basically harmful, the 0% GDP deficit, do you think in the long term it will be amended, or will they remain like that?
Oh, it's outright stupid. I think that I mean, the interesting thing about all these things is that they have they point in a certain direction, but they are never really implemented. No country has zero budget deficit. And when Belgium entered the EMU, for instance, it had a debt to GDP ratio of 120%. So these norms have an enormous, how do you say that, rhetoric value. And in that sense, you should never take them too precise. And I never think that the 0% will be taken that precise. That's one part of my answer. The other part of my answer is that nonetheless, underlying this is a certain notion of Calvinism, I would say, austerity thinking, which is quite dangerous in a situation where the other sectors are in balance. And either, as long as the other sectors remain in balance, they will not be applied, or people will start to realize that we should also look at the other sectors. There have already been discussions about norms about the current account, for instance. And you can imagine that these norms will be changed in that direction also, that you should see them in relation to other aspects of the economy. And I think that would be much more sensible and make also more economic sense. What you should realize is that this 3% and this 60%, maybe you are under the illusion that there has been a task force which was given the task to define percentages which should be taken into the Maastricht Treaty, and that after long deliberations they came up with 3% and 60%. This is not true at all. 1 month before the Maastricht Treaty, this 3 and 60% did not exist actually. And all of a sudden they were there, and all the economists start to ask, where the hell do they come from? And afterwards, there came a lot of rationalizations why it could be a sensible measure. If this and this and this and this is the case, I can defend that 3% and 60% is sustainable. That was basically the story. But if this and this and this is not the case, it's not sustainable. I mean, so these were typically politicians which said, if we do not quantify things, it will not work. And they chose a norm which seemed sensible, and they happened to coincide with Germany at the time, so that might be sensible. And then they chose those norms, and this is the way they started to take their own life and became very important in the political rhetoric. But economically, they are quite contested.
Thanks a lot.